This is the webinar put on by Lighthouse Lab Services, and today we're going to be speaking with a guest speaker, Gail Javitt. She's a director at Hyman Phelps McNamara, and so we're in for a treat. She has an excellent background and is going to give us a better understanding of a topic that's very often confused with LDTs and shifting policy by FDA, it seems like. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Gail, then we're going to go through some housekeeping. So Ms. Javitt provides strategic FDA regulatory advice for leading medical device, diagnostic, pharmaceutical, biological products, human cellular, and tissue-based products through the product lifespan, and has successfully resolved disputes at both the pre- and post-market stage. She also has, even more importantly, significant experience advising clinical laboratories, CLIA laboratories, on FDA requirements for lab-developed tests in particular. Ms. Javitt's experience prior to joining Hyman Phelps McNamara includes serving as a partner in a leading Washington, D.C. health law practice and as a law and policy director at the Genetics and Public Policy Center, part of Johns Hopkins University. At the center, she was responsible for developing policy options to guide the development and use of reproductive and other genetic technologies. Earlier in her legal career, Ms. Javitt checked for the Honorable Gary Taylor at the U.S. District Court for the CDC, or for the Central District of California. In addition, Ms. Javitt has published and spoken widely on issues at the intersection of law, science, ethics, and policy, including FDA regulation of genetic testing, precision medicine, next-generation sequencing. Her academic experience includes serving as a faculty member at the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Johns Hopkins University and as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center, American University's Washington College of Law, and the University of Maryland School of Law. She was previously at Greenwald Fellow in Bioethics and Health Policy, and a collaborative effort between Johns Hopkins University and Georgetown University. So great credentials with us today, a real treat to have her, and we're looking forward to getting into the details. A little bit about us, Lighthouse Lab Services. We put these on for free. We'd love to keep them free. The reason that we're able to do that is we do provide services to clinical labs. So if we can ever be of assistance, please let us know. We do have a team of people that are providing medical laboratory directors to almost 300 CLIA labs around the country. We do staffing. We're the largest staffing firm that focuses on recruiting medical laboratory professionals. So if you're having a hard time finding PCR techs or anything else, we'd love to hear about that and help. We also start up new labs from scratch as a turnkey solution, or we can unbundle those services. So if you're thinking of getting into the game or you're adding a line of testing, we can send in our team to validate an LDT, which we're going to be talking about a little bit today. So let us know if that's something that we can assist you with. And now we're going to go ahead and turn over the slide deck to Gail to go through today's topic, which is the impact of the FDA's recent shift on COVID LDTs. Thank you, Gail. It's all yours.
Thank you, John. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here to talk about a topic that I know we've been thinking about a lot for the past 2 years and longer, and I'm sure everybody participating has also been thinking about quite a bit. So let me cut to the chase with what I want to cover this afternoon, the key points that I'd like to get across. FDA's approach to regulating laboratory developed tests, we know as LDTs, for almost 3 decades has been, to say the least, unsettled. COVID-19 highlighted the underlying instability of the regulatory scheme and the consequences for clinical laboratories and the public of the instability. Clinical labs have played a critical role in the availability of testing during the pandemic. FDA's approach during this time with respect to regulating LDTs as well as IVDs, which we really won't touch on today, has undergone numerous shifts, has caused confusion and has limited test availability, and has required rapid adaptation by clinical laboratories to these changing regulatory requirements. Most recently, which is what brings us here today, FDA announced a policy change in its approach to LDTs for COVID-19 on November 15th, 2021. And the timing of EUA submissions that are now required, the ability of laboratories to offer testing while those EUAs are under review, and the likelihood of being granted an EUA now that they are again required for laboratories is dependent on a number of factors that we're still learning at this time. The impact of this change is unclear. It's still too soon to say entirely. And more than that, the policy for LDTs beyond COVID still remains uncertain, as are the prospects of getting legislation that might lend some clarity to the subject. So let me try to explain how we got here briefly. So as everybody knows, we started what became known as a pandemic back in 2020, the beginning of 2020, and the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services determined that a public health emergency existed because of those cases of what was then known as 2019 NCOV. And then that in turn triggered a declaration that there were circumstances that justified authorization of the emergency use of in vitro diagnostics for detecting COVID-19. And this is where FDA gets its statutory authority to require emergency use authorizations for IVDs, as well as other types of COVID products, drugs, and many other kinds of PPEs and other devices. Now, whether that authority does or should extend to LDTs is debatable, but clearly FDA has made the choice to do so. Whether FDA would do so was initially unclear at the outset of the pandemic, and certainly it was not required for FDA to do so. And now, if you'll indulge me, this requires a brief digression into the broader history of FDA's oversight of LDTs, because to understand what happened in the pandemic, really need a bit of context for the instability and the source of that instability that I referred to at the beginning. So as most people on this call likely already know, in vitro diagnostics are products that clinical laboratories use to perform testing. They are regulated as medical devices under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which includes instruments and other types of products, including in vitro reagents that are intended for diagnosis of disease and conditions. And then there's a further definition of IVDs in the regulations that is more specific. Like other medical devices, IVDs are regulated on a risk-based, based on risk-based prioritization, class 1 being the least risky, class 3 being the most risky. All devices, regardless of risk, are subject to certain general controls, such as registering with FDA, listing products, reporting and record keeping, compliance with good manufacturing practices, or what's known in the device world as QSR, and sometimes submission of 510K premarket notification, or even in rarer cases, the submission of a premarket approval application. And then beyond class 1, for devices that FDA believes need additional oversight, special controls such as performance standards or patient registries can be required as well. And under the statute, there are a variety of penalties that manufacturers of devices can face for noncompliance. LDTs are tests that are performed in clinical laboratories. Now, they may use and often do use IVDs, but they are developed by the laboratory as opposed to being purchased as a kit that's already assembled. Laboratories are regulated under CLIA, the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, which applies to all laboratories that test human specimens for diagnosis or health assessment. CLIA certification is also tiered based on risk, and labs must have the type of CLIA certificate that is commensurate with the type of testing they're performing. Now, CLIA sort of has a different approach than the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to regulation. CLIA is a lab quality statute, so focuses on the appropriate training and qualifications of the personnel, how records are conducting, how things are reported, making sure that laboratories are doing proper analytical validation and proficiency testing and doing periodic inspection. Unlike FDA, which can require pre-market review of tests and can require evidence of clinical validity, CLIA really leaves a lot to the discretion and the responsibility of the laboratory director to make sure the tests are appropriate to be offered and appropriately performed once they are offered. And CMS oversees CLIA in conjunction with states. Both have the authority to revoke certificates for noncompliance. So there are penalties under CLIA as well, although slightly different. Now, turning to how did LDTs get into the mix? Excuse me. FDA got authority to regulate medical devices in 1976. Initially, when FDA issued regulations to implement this law, laboratories were carved out. FDA said full-service laboratories and similar establishments are exempted from registration as medical device manufacturers. This changed beginning in the 1990s. FDA asserted that LDTs were actually a type of medical device, and laboratories therefore could be regulated as medical device manufacturers. But FDA articulated what's been a policy of quote-unquote enforcement discretion, meaning the discretion not to enforce laws they're entitled to enforce. When questioned about the fact that labs had been carved out earlier in the regulation, FDA has said that today's laboratories and today's tests are different from what they were talking about back then, and so a different approach is justified. So we've been in a period of mostly enforcement discretion for a number of decades, with periodic departures and sometimes sudden departures from that policy for tests that FDA views as posing higher risk. And for example, labs offering tests for cancer screening, direct-to-consumer genetic tests, pharmacogenomic tests. These are examples when FDA has expressed concern, and the way FDA generally expresses concern in the first instance is by sending a warning letter to a laboratory that is offering the test saying this is a medical device, and if you want to offer it, you need to get appropriate pre-market review. There have been episodic proposals by FDA for a comprehensive regulatory framework that have not to date come to fruition. But as comes as no surprise to anybody on this call, I'm sure, this has generated much uncertainty over many years in the laboratory community. I'm not planning to go through this slide, but this timeline, I think just the visual is a way of showing just how much churn has happened in the past 2+ decades with respect to LDTs. And sometimes it seems like much has happened and little has changed. So let me just point, and the story here really is episodic attempts by FDA to regulate LDTs, episodic exercise of enforcement over certain types of LDTs, and then ultimately no systematic approach to the regulation of LDTs. So the yellow are all the times that yellow highlighted words are things that FDA has expressed concern about and sought to regulate. And then the green highlighted terms show where FDA pulled back and then did not finalize a regulatory approach. So with that brief digression, I hope that gives a little bit of context for backdrop in which we found ourselves when the pandemic emerged. So as I mentioned before, the secretary declared an emergency, and then FDA started requiring emergency use authorizations for both in vitro diagnostics for COVID and for LDTs. Initially, though, FDA, and this was the first EUA that FDA authorized, FDA authorized it for the CDC's test, and the idea was that CDC's test would be the only one that laboratories could use to test for COVID-19. CDC would ship the testing materials to qualified public health laboratories, so that they could perform the assay. It soon became apparent that there was a problem with one of the controls, and the tests were not working properly. And so a delay in testing. Against this backdrop, FDA was offered help from laboratories. The Association of Public Health Laboratories sent a letter saying, please exercise enforcement discretion so that we can get involved in standing up LDTs for COVID. This was endorsed as well by the American Association of Clinical Chemistry. FDA said, no, thank you. And then FDA issued the first of many guidance documents outlining FDA's expectations for COVID-19 tests offered by clinical laboratories. Excuse me. Now, as I said before, FDA did not have to take this approach, and it's not an approach that was taken in all previous episodes of infectious disease, which thankfully did not become pandemics. FDA could have exercised enforcement discretion, but in this instance chose not to. So under the initial policy that FDA issued at the end of February 2020, high complexity clinical laboratories that were interested in providing COVID-19 testing were required to submit emergency use authorization applications to FDA. FDA said that they could develop and begin using these tests before receiving an EUA, that they were required to notify FDA when they began testing and to submit a completed EUA within 2 weeks of such notification. Laboratories offering serology tests needed to notify but not to submit an EUA. And FDA posted these notifications on its website. FDA amended this policy to provide an alternative path shortly thereafter, saying to states, if you want to take responsibility for COVID tests for labs in your jurisdiction, you're free to do so. 9 states took FDA up on that offer. So not a whole lot. And then not much happened. Well, so labs started to submit EUAs and go through that process with varying success until on August 19th, 2020, HHS said, FDA, don't regulate LDTs. You may not regulate LDTs unless you go through what's called notice and comment rulemaking, which is an administrative law term that basically says federal agencies have to make public the process of making rules and get public comment for those rules before they do that. Now, this is something FDA has never done for LDTs, which has been a source of criticism by those who argue that since regulating LDTs is a substantive departure from what FDA has done historically, rulemaking is needed. FDA has always said rulemaking is not needed. In this case, HHS said rulemaking is needed, which essentially stopped FDA from regulating. And it was written broadly enough that while HHS's target clearly was COVID testing to relax requirements on laboratories seeking to offer COVID-19 LDTs, its policy covered all LDTs. HHS also in its announcement said any previous guidance on LDTs that had been issued by FDA are rescinded. They don't exist anymore. And along with this, this decision was supported by a legal memorandum that was sent to FDA by HHS's then general counsel, but was made public in Politico, questioning FDA's legal authority, or at least the breadth of FDA's claimed authority over LDTs generally. In response to that, FDA then said, well, we will no longer review any LDTs, EUAs for LDTs, even if laboratories want them. And by this point, a number of laboratories had them and wanted amendments to them, and it was unclear whether that would happen. And laboratories that didn't yet have them, also some wanted them because of the liability protections that come along with having emergency use authorizations that are provided under the statute, and for other reasons as well, no doubt. in response to that, HHS said, no, FDA, if laboratories want EUAs, you have to review them. So this was a very unusual public spat between HHS, which is the department that oversees FDA, and FDA, the agency that is supposed to, in some sense, take direction from HHS. It was unusual and not helpful to those trying to figure out what the rules were. So the upshot of that, though, was starting in August of 2020, laboratories could proceed and offer COVID tests without going through FDA, without getting an EUA if they wanted to do that, and many did. Until, this brings us up to the present date almost, November 15th, 2021, the new administration, there was an election in between there, as we all may recall, HHS rescinded its August 20th policy, saying we're withdrawing that policy that was established during the previous administration that limited FDA's ability to address certain problematic COVID-19 tests. By withdrawing the policy, HHS is helping to ensure that COVID-19 tests work as intended. Effective today, HHS no longer has a policy on LDTs that is separate from FDA's longstanding approach in this area. Now, that word problematic is interesting. FDA also has asserted or alluded to certain problems with LDTs for COVID-19 that FDA has observed, but has never really given details about what those problems have been, but has certainly justified the desire to regulate LDTs because of certain problematic LDTs it has observed. So along with HHS's announcement, hand in hand, FDA issued an updated policy outlining its expectations for laboratories that wanted to offer COVID LDTs. And the types of changes that were proposed or that were described in the November 15th guidance fall into two broad buckets: substantive changes to requirements and a change to FDA's prioritization of review, what EUAs FDA wanted to see and would weigh in on. FDA pointed out that the grant of an EUA is discretionary, so FDA doesn't have to review or come to a decision on any submission for an EUA. So turning to the substantive changes first, FDA said that laboratories that had been offering LDT serology tests based on the notification policy, as well as laboratories offering LDTs without an EUA based on the announcement by HHS in August 2020, would now need to submit an EUA within 60 calendar days, which turns out to be January 14th, so just passed, but could continue to offer their tests as long as they submitted an EUA within that time frame, while the EUA was pending FDA review. Laboratories who did not submit within 60 days were expected to stop offering their testing. This policy was limited to LDTs certified as high complexity under CLIA, did not, for example, include home collection. And FDA said it would not authorize a test if the submission does not demonstrate that the test has been appropriately validated, including validation with clinical specimens using an appropriate comparator. If FDA denied the EUA, the laboratory would be expected to stop offering testing within 15 days. Now, for laboratories seeking to introduce new LDTs after November 15th, so those who had not yet been offering testing prior to November 15th, they would be required to submit an EUA request and wait for FDA authorization. In addition, the policy addressed laboratories that wanted to make modifications to EUA authorized molecular diagnostic IVDs or LDTs. And here again, there was a difference between changes that would be made after the policy was announced and changes that had already been made before the policy was announced. So turning to after November 15th, certain types of modifications could be made without amending or submitting a new EUA, as long as there was no change to the indication for use, there was no change in the analyte-specific reagents that were being used, the laboratory validated the change and confirmed its equivalency to the authorized test it was being changed from. And again, the modified test was performed only in the CLIA certified high complexity lab that made the modification. If modifications had already been made before November 15th, laboratories could continue offering them as long as those modifications had been made in accordance with what had been FDA's policy on modifications. Now, turning to the second prong of the November 15th policy change, FDA's changes in prioritization. And as I said before, this affected both IVD manufacturers and laboratories. We're focusing today on the effect of laboratories. So for laboratories, the changes in prioritization were that FDA said it would be focusing on reviewing EUAs for molecular diagnostic LDTs that were highly sensitive, high throughput, intended for pooling, home collection, screening, or detection of multiple analytes, and focusing on serology LDTs intended for quantitative detection of neutralizing antibodies or intended for the quantitative measurement of antibody titers. For both types of tests, FDA expressed the desire that the submissions come from experienced developers with the ability to scale up manufacturing capacity. And FDA set a target of at least 500,000 tests per week within 3 months of getting an EUA. So what has the impact been of this change? So, of course, it's hard to say. It's still pretty new, but here's what we know so far. Understanding the changes and the pre-November 15th and the post-November 15th and what modifications can be made and what modifications can't be made and et cetera has been very challenging, as anybody who's tried to read the November 15th policy update knows. Many questions have been raised. The answers have been unclear in many cases regarding, for example, what has to go into an EUA submission for an LDT, as well as what modifications need an EUA submission or an EUA amendment. FDA has, to some extent, addressed these questions during its virtual town hall meetings, which have occurred biweekly since the start of the pandemic. So they're up to almost, I think they've held 80 in the past 2 years. The last two have focused on the November 15 policy largely. And it's also possible to submit questions to the EUA request mailbox that FDA has. Response times to submitting these questions has been variable. And there's lots of unknowns at this point. As I said, the deadline for submitting EUAs has just passed. How many were submitted is unclear. How many labs that were offering LDTs did not submit and presumably will stop offering their tests is also not known. What the review times for all these submissions that FDA has called for is not known. How many FDA will view as meeting their prioritization criteria and their substantive review criteria, also unknown. One interesting factoid, although I'm not sure what we make of it, but it is interesting, is that prior to the November 15 policy change, FDA had authorized about 420 COVID tests total, and only about 25 of these were LDTs. And I think there's likely a number of reasons for that, but it will be interesting to see what the proportion of LDTs authorized post-November 15th is compared with IVDs. So what about non-COVID LDTs? The answer is FDA has not addressed this question, I think because it's been a little busy for a lot of resources going to reviewing the COVID EUAs. So we don't have any feedback from FDA about what its plans are more broadly with LDTs. I think it's fair to assume that we're back in that pre-August 2020 status quo of enforcement discretion most of the time. I think it's also fair to say that it would be unlikely that FDA would issue any major announcements on LDT policy until some of the bills that are currently pending in Congress have been considered and either enacted or not enacted. I don't think this FDA would feel constrained if they saw an LDT with high risk out there from taking action, sending a warning letter. But I think it would be on an ad hoc basis if that were to occur. So that's a good segue into legislation. So what about legislative attempts? Well, there have been a lot of them, as this slide shows, and none of them has resulted in FDA into Congress clarifying, changing, enhancing, or withdrawing FDA authority over LDTs. So let me just focus on the most recent legislative proposals. But before doing that, rather than going through each of these, let me try to summarize the basic similarities and differences that have come up over time. Certainly, there have been many differences between different proposals, with some seeking to strengthen and consolidate FDA's authority, some seeking to take FDA completely out of the equation and enhance the role of CLIA over laboratories offering LDTs, some proposing a new agency or new organization within FDA to oversee them. But there's been a few recurring themes, regardless of these differences, that any oversight should be risk-based, that modifications should be easy, recognizing that labs often have to make modifications in light of changing circumstances, that any tests already out there be grandfathered, so that any legislative change be prospective only, and that there be a process for post-market reporting. Now, the VALID Act came out on the side of enhancing FDA's authority and clarifying FDA's authority to regulate LDTs, as well as creating a system that had some parity between LDTs and IVDs, so it wasn't this tale of two pathways. The VALID Act stands for the Verifying Accurate Leading Edge IVCT Development Act. This, if it were to be enacted, and we expect that it will be discussed in the context of the upcoming user fee reauthorization legislation, but if it were to be enacted, it would be the largest change in diagnostic regulation since CLIA 88, and arguably ever. It would not be such a big change for IVD manufacturers that are already subject to regulation, but for labs, it would be really a sea change, given the number of LDTs that are currently out there for clinical use without FDA oversight. It's a very long statute. It's very complicated. In broad strokes, it creates a single category for all diagnostics called the IVCT, which comprises both IVDs and LDTs. There are many parallels to the current medical device framework. The idea of risk-based classification with low-risk IVCTs not requiring pre-market review, high risk requiring the most stringent review, moderate requiring a sort of approval, although it's not 510K. Similarities to the current quality system regulations, similarities to the current adulteration, misbranding, and post-market surveillance requirements under the current statute. Plus, there are other components of VALID, such as grandfathering, an ability to transition tests from the pre to the post pre-legislation, post-legislation environment. FDA would have the ability to ask for information of an otherwise exempt LDT. There would be the option of breakthrough designation, which IVDs currently now can access, but not LDTs. User fees would be required, which would be another big change for laboratories. There would be a provision for emergency use of tests, not just for pandemic, but broader emergency use. And there would be a comprehensive test information system that would allow FDA to create and maintain a database about IVCTs that were available. And there would be a long effective date. So between the time if it were to be enacted, it would be 4 years until it became effective, and final rules would be 2 years after enactment. So there would be a long period to adjust. So when I wrapping it up, when I tried to figure out how to bring all this together, this is the image that just stuck in my mind. Certainly the past 2 years for laboratories and those advising laboratories has felt like a roller coaster, with lots of twists and turns and changes that have required pivoting and reassessing. And I think more broadly, those of us who have advised on LDT oversight for the past 2+ decades, it has felt like a lot of ups and downs. And while sometimes it feels like we have come back to where we started, the ride has sometimes been bumpy. So with that, let me pause and see if there are any questions.
Yes, thank you, Gail. That was a lot, and it was really, really helpful. That's quite a mess, and thank you for helping us to make some sense of it. That's the most comprehensive review of the history of LDTs and the FDA that I've ever seen, and there's just so much good information in there, and I learned a lot, and I felt like I knew a lot of it already. So I really appreciate you going through that. Before we jump into the questions, I wanted to go over a couple things. So we had a couple polls that were out there that I wanted to quickly just summarize a review. We did ask everybody, you guys can look at your poll section under closed polls, but which part of the November 15th change in policy was the biggest challenge for you? And it looks like by a large margin, that lack of clarity is what laboratories are finding to be the biggest challenge there, followed by the 2 million tests per month throughput limit. The next question talked about how lax, was it too lax or not lax enough prior to November 15th? And it looks like maybe almost 25%, quarter of you thought that it was too lax prior to November 15th, and the rest of you felt like it was probably about right for the situation. You know, relaxing oversight was necessary because we were in the fog of war. And then the impact of that, measuring that, November 15th change, has your lab paused offering your COVID LDT due to this regulation change? About 5% of you had paused. Looks like 40% of you already were under EUA, and then another 55% of you are waiting. So hopefully this webinar was particularly helpful to those 55% that were waiting, and 60% of respondents to the first question that said the lack of clarity was really the biggest issue. So we're hoping to solve that. Prior to getting to the Q&A, which we will get to, I wanted to give you all another opportunity, and you'll see it coming onto your screen, to express interest in speaking with Hyman Phelps and McNamara. If you have an issue that was not able to be addressed and you need to go deeper, you can engage Hyman Phelps and McNamara to go deeper on this. They're experts in this area, and I'd encourage you to do so. We've done that at times, and we've always been really happy with the results that we've gotten from them. And then also wanted to just give a brief plug, hopefully a solution to you, that Lighthouse does have a FDA EUA approved assay. So if you are not in a situation where you are compliant and you need to be in an FDA EUA approved assay, we do have a swab-based assay called COVID Now, as well as a saliva-based assay called Saliva Now that we can assist with. We validate that for free. So we can come into your lab and get that set up, and we should be less expensive than what you're spending on reagents now. That's been the case in pretty much all situations we've talked to clients. So let us know if we can help. If you do find yourself in a predicament where you need to make a change. So we're going to get into the Q&A. We have a lot of good questions, so I appreciate the audience, and I think it's credit to Gail being able to demonstrate how complicated this was. But let's jump into a few of them. We won't be able to cover them all because we already are a little bit long, and I know a lot of people do this during their lunch hour. But some of the questions, one of the more common ones, Gail, was, okay, we've submitted our FDA for EUA to the FDA for EUA. Can we test while we're waiting? Do you have an opinion on what a laboratory should do during that pending process while they're waiting to hear back?
So these are laboratories that already were offering testing prior to November 15th?
I think there were maybe labs that were not validated prior to the 15th. They now have an LDT. They're filing with the FDA, and hopefully Shannon, I hope I'm interpreting your question correctly, but they're bringing a new LDT to market. They fill out and notify the FDA. Is the notification sufficient, or do they need to wait for some sort of approval?
Yeah, so if they were not offering the test prior to November 15th, then they would need to wait until FDA authorizes the test to start testing.
That's what I thought. So yeah, just submitting and notifying not enough. You'd recommend waiting to get the green light. We have another question from Paul that's saying the FDA has not approved any LDT COVID tests since April of 2020. We are approved under CLIA in the state of Massachusetts. According to HHS, they have no authority for restricting testing for CLIA-approved tests. I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, Gail, that there were some states that maybe took this into their own hands. If you're in one of those states, and if Massachusetts is one, I don't know, do they need to get the FDA involved?
So Massachusetts is not one of the 9. I don't have the slide in front of me, but it lists the 9. So if the state, one of those 9 states, has taken responsibility, tell the FDA they've taken responsibility, and the laboratories in that jurisdiction, and the laboratory follows whatever requirements the state has set up, then no, an EUA is not required.
Perfect. We have a question coming in from Canada. Does the change of LDTs, does FDA change affect labs that are operating in Canada?
That's a great question. So are the laboratories testing specimens from the US?
Sounds like that one might be one we need to dig into a little bit further to get more information on.
Yeah, I think that would be a critical question a piece of information to know in fielding that one.
Okay. We got another question about, what if this is the first time you've heard this news, right? So one individual is saying, hey, our lab director never told us about this. The deadline has passed. What do we do now? Can we ask for an extension? Can we continue to test in the meantime?
That is a great question. And I think there's a lot of, I hesitate to give a blanket answer because I think the considerations may vary and the risks may vary depending on the lab and the test and the circumstances. I think it's fair to say FDA's expectation is that if you were offering a test prior to November 15th and you want to continue doing so, you should get a submission in as soon as possible. What FDA's approach will be to those that missed the deadline but fully intend to submit will be, I don't know. And it's not a question that I have seen come up in the virtual town halls, although it is a good question, I think, to submit preferably on a de-identified basis to the EUA inbox if the lab wants more clarity on that.
Yeah, we had another question that was similar about what the enforcement looked like, trying to quantify that. Has there been anything stated about kind of what enforcement would look like for non-compliant labs?
I haven't seen anything explicitly stated. I mean, FDA's could exercise a lot of different types of enforcement mechanisms. We certainly have seen warning letters generally for COVID-19 products, including tests, but broader than tests. And FDA has reached out to companies and laboratories when it has felt there was an issue or something being offered that shouldn't be, or that required a different kind of authorization. So I wouldn't be surprised if FDA starts doing that here, but I have not seen anything specifically addressing it.
Sure. We had another question come in from someone saying, hey, if I'm a laboratory, the manufacturer holds an FDA EUA, on the assay. Do I also need to file with the FDA to use that, or am I covered by the manufacturer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you are a laboratory using an IVD that has an EUA, in general, you don't need a separate EUA. If you where it gets a little complicated, as my slides may have indicated, is if you want to make a modification to an IVD that has an EUA, in some cases FDA will want will consider that to be an LDT that then requires the submission. But it depends on the type of change that you're making to the EUA, to the IVD EUA.
Sure. Well, we could probably spend the rest of the afternoon here, but we won't. So I encourage you guys, Gail's information is on the screen. We did do that pop-up. If you filled that out, you'll get connected and you'll hear from their team. But if you have additional questions, check out hpm.com is the website with more information about Gail's group and the services that they provide. Before we go, just going to mention our next upcoming webinar, which is going to be on how labs can comply with the new surprise billing rules, right? So that's another change that's out there. That's going to be held on Wednesday, February 23rd at 12 o'clock. And we'd encourage you to register for that if that's something that you feel like would be helpful for you. So thank you guys all so much for attending today. We will continue to do these on a monthly basis. And a special thanks to Gail for spending her lunch hour educating us on this. And so please reach out to her if you have questions. Thank you,
Jon, and thanks everybody for the great questions.